Chris Fonye, human rights activist of Cameroon descent, now based in Canberra, Australia. Chris Fonye, without much ado, I'd like you to introduce yourself to the viewers. Over to you, sir.
Good morning from Canberra. Thank you so much, Tunji, for having me. It is an honor to be your guest. My name is Christian Lambang Fonye from Cameroon. I previously worked in Cameroon as a protection officer with the National Human Rights Commission. I've worked extensively with the civil society in Cameroon and in the domains of human rights and development. I currently work as an activist with Amnesty International Australia, where I have been involved in a good number of campaigns, ranging from refugee rights, supporting people at risk all around the world, also working hard to advance climate justice, civil and political rights, and a wide scope of human rights. I've equally worked as a settlement officer, focusing on the settlement needs of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And that is just to summarize the host of things which I do, apart from working with other networks and African civil society organizations that work to advance the rights of people of African descent. Just to add to that, I am a 2020 fellow of the United Nations Program for People of African Descent, and whose mandate is actually to advance the rights for people of African descent in Australia and across the world.
Thank you. That's a long page to read through. Yeah, you do know that done a lot, and I want to add to the viewers too that Chris Fonye is the Secretary General of Movement for Democracy, Development, and Transparency. Do you want to quickly tell us what's happening over there in regards to MDDT? Any latest news?
Yeah, MDDT, it's a youth-led organization, which I would say it's much more like a family to me, because I've worked for more than 10 years with MDDT. MDDT is one of the leading youth-led organizations that are working within the context of the crisis, advocating for dialogue as the most sustainable way to the end of the ongoing conflict in southern Cameroon. MDDT works in the areas of governance, human rights, the rule of law, and peace building. But most of all, they have an inclination towards youth development as the basis for the future, and as with the understanding that that's the cream of society that can change mindsets, especially in a world or in a country that has been ravaged by war.
Wow, interesting. Let's you are you're like analysts, like political analysts, international political analysts. I want some of your views doesn't really align with sanction, which is a very important tool in international politics, as you know. Why are you doubtful about the power of sanction and the effectiveness?
Well, I wouldn't say I am doubtful, but it's much more. I consider myself more of a realist, and I tend to hold my opinion based on aspects that are measurable. Sanctions are mechanisms which are used to bring pressure to states to either behave in a certain way, or individuals and even non-state actors to make them act in a way that that the international community, or maybe the actor providing the sanction, finds befitting. But what has become very challenging recently about the sanctions is the challenge of being able to separate the target, that is the object that is being targeted for these sanctions, as opposed to the beneficiaries, which is supposed to be the populations. The problem, the perpetual challenge that seems to be with administrating sanctions, is that it tends to hurt the victims or the beneficiaries for which these sanctions are destined to help. And so it tends to punish them double. I'll give you a very good example. For instance, a country like Afghanistan, which is right now almost stateless in terms of governance capacity. If you add sanctions already to the carnage which they are experiencing at the hands of the Taliban regime, in as much as the goal is to cause that regime to change course, but it tends to punish the Afghan civilians double, which then causes us to think and probably reflect if we could consider much more innovative ways of making countries behave without having a double effect on those who are already vulnerable and experiencing very, very, very acute suffering.
So, in other words, you're trying to say it's a case of two elephants fighting, the grass suffers. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's what we do.
Sometimes the challenge with those sanctions, actually, it's not the intention. I think the intention behind sanctions is usually good, but its implementation, the pragmatic implementation of these sanctions makes it such that at the end of the day, the population suffers double. And when we know the context of maybe African countries where you have the governors having access to resources, although all they may do in such a situation is just simply plunder more state resources to keep themselves more comfortable, while the huge impact of these sanctions affect the people even double. So we find ourselves in a situation where good intentions do not necessarily lead to the intended result. And as a result, and as a consequence, progressively, it creates an anti-Western sentiment in these countries because they then feel the burden of the backlash of these sanctions, and it then gives different interpretations because of the acute suffering which comes with this method.
So, what do you think is an alternative to this instrument, this all-important instrument of international politics?
I would say there's no one-size-fits-all approach in things like that. The international community and political strategists have come up with the word targeted sanctions. That means finding the most effective ways to ensure that these sanctions hit the intended target, rather than adopt an approach that tends to inflict what some may call collateral damage on people that are not meant to suffer from the consequences. So targeted sanctions could be one of them. There could also be some kind of diplomatic pressure, which may entail, for instance, boycotts of very, very important events, freezing of accounts, and a whole host of other methods that are specifically intended to
restrictions. I mean, restrictions as for the bad guys, if we can say
exactly.
That can okay. All right, we coming to the crunch of the matter now. You are from southern Cameroon, and we know it's at the high of the storm, even though probably nobody's talking about it. We're coming to that. That's another matter entirely. So, but do you want to just intimate us? It's an opportunity for you to tell us the side we've not been hearing about, and what's really the genesis of this problem, this crisis, the Ambazonia crisis. What's the root cause, comrade?
The root cause it's the unfinished business of decolonialization and the effects that have come with poor negotiation of coexistence between two exclusive nations that existed prior to their unity. In brief, that's what is called today the Southern Cameroons used to be the British Southern Cameroons, which prior to its independence existed as a state on its own and had its independence on a different date from La République du Cameroun, which is usually termed French Cameroon, to this as a way of distinguishing it from the English-speaking Cameroon. That is, the English-speaking or the British Southern Cameroons, which today is just summarized and called Southern Cameroons, is the territory that was colonized, or the territory that was held under trusteeship by the British to prepare them for independence, while the La République du Cameroun was French-speaking Cameroon. And to keep it short, La République du Cameroun had its independence in 1960. These dates are symbolic because that in itself is overwhelming evidence to tell you that these are entities that existed separately, while the Southern Cameroon had its independence on a different date. Now, to fast forward, while preparing Southern Cameroon for independence, the problem is the Southern Cameroon was asked a question to have independence by association rather than autonomously like every other nation would have. The Southern Cameroon was asked to have independence by either joining Nigeria or La République du Cameroun. And finally, following the results of that plebiscite, the Southern Cameroons joined French Cameroon. And that is how La République du Cameroun, which is also called French Cameroon. In some books, they might call it East Cameroon, just to clarify the doubts of the audience and people that may read these complexities that come with the nomenclatures. So actually, that's how the Southern Cameroon acquired its independence. But what was? I
just want to ask a question that I don't understand. Was it like a two-state solution or something like that? Was that what happened?
I'm actually coming to that. So in 1961, these two territories agreed to coexist under a federal constitution. Now that comes to the idea of two-state solution. That would bring together two equal states, bijural states, bicultural, and bilingual. And that was enshrined in their constitution. And much more interestingly, there was a provision in that constitution that said that the form of the state could not be altered without the exclusive consent of one of the parties, which was aborted in 1972 when the president. You would want to understand that when these two states came together, naturally, the French-speaking side of the French-speaking Cameroon was a majority. So the political arrangement that emanated from that saw the leader of French-speaking Cameroon as president, and the leader from Southern Cameroon as vice, and subsequently became prime minister. And
was that a bit similar to like Egypt, Syria, two states relationship? Sometimes ago in history, there was a time Egypt had a president, Syria has a vice president. The two countries came together. Like we also have Senegal and Gambia at some point. Was it something similar?
Something similar, but definitely with its own with its own uniqueness. To respond simply to your question, it was a two-state solution of equal status, and the idea was to ensure that the cultural, economic, and political specificities of these regions were respected, and that would be the basis of a peaceful coexistence. But that did not happen because in 1972, through the shrewd support of France and imperial machinations, La République du Cameroun dissolved the federation and transformed it into a unitary state. Through what a lot of political analysts, pundits have called it a constitutional coup. Now, what happened was they created a referendum that has been highly described as a fictitious one, which did not reflect, in a very strict sense, the constitutional provision in the 1960, the federal constitution that required the exclusive consent of one of the parties. Now, when you take into context the number, remember I drew your attention to the fact that La République du Cameroon in such a union would have naturally the majority. So should they go into any form of referendum, the method of that referendum could not be considered from a numerical point of view, but should have been considered from a structural point of view to find out if the people of the Southern Cameroons liked that. So what they simply did was they made a question, they created a question that will entail every Cameroonian to vote. That naturally means that the majority of people that voted for that unitary state were French speaking. So how do you decide a matter of, that's like self-determination? How does another person decide another person's right to self-determination? So you can already see that from that point, the sources of trouble, or the roots of conflict had already been sowed. Now, after the referendum, because you're going to read in some books, and that is what can be very confusing, because there's been a lot of intellectual dishonesty about this propaganda to help to erase the historical reality of how this state came about, the complexity of the existence of what is today Cameroon. That is some of the currents that you're going to read, constitutional referendum and all that kind of stuff. But something fundamental changed. Before 1972, Southern Cameroon had their own institutions. That is even what makes it most, it makes it a bitter pill to swallow, because this is a territory that had a government, had economic institutes, had every functional aspect that you would have in a normal functioning government. And to even make it more interesting, the Southern Cameroons is one of the territories in the whole of Africa that organized democratic elections prior to independence. So that was an area that already had a sense of pluralistic democracy without any form of power struggle. So these are people that had been civilized in the culture of the common law, in the culture of political, I mean, a little bit much more related to the political activism in Nigeria. As a matter of fact, it used to be administered as part of the Eastern House of Assembly in Nigeria. Just at a certain point, when the question for independence had to put them in a position where they had to choose between Nigeria and Cameroon, then they chose Cameroon. So when you even look at even the date for independence for the Southern Cameroon, yes, it kind of coincides with Nigeria. So it's much more, these are people whose self-determination was not left for them to decide. And that has been the source of all the troubles which they have known since independence till now. So after 1972, moving to a unitary state of government, you would understand that almost everything was controlled from the center. And that led to the progressive marginalization, and some would even say enslavement, and the recolonialization of the Southern Cameroons, because they now lost all their state institutions. We used to have a police force that had a different way of ensuring law enforcement. These people were not used to repression. We had more of police constables who would enforce law much more in a civil manner. The kind of police force that rather support civilians rather than the French method, which tends to be brutal and which tends to adopt a very, very repressive approach. And so these are the practical differences that Southern Cameroonians joining the French-speaking side of Cameroon actually started experiencing, and started making them feel like they were deceived into getting into this union. The idea of getting them into this union was actually to subsequently assimilate them and then make them second-class citizens and even slaves to the French Cameroonian regime. And that is what has prevailed till date. And it's also important to say that even after the 1972, in different parts, at different times of Cameroon's history, you've always had the resurgence of this problem in a bid to draw attention to the state of Cameroon to revert back to the 1961 constitutional arrangement, which was a two-state solution. Now, somewhere in the 90s, the very, very first, what should have been the first English-speaking president, Mr. Nejon Fundi, which ushered in the birth of real multi-party politics in Cameroon. When he won the election, the Speaker of the National Assembly, or the head of the Supreme Court, interestingly declared that his hands were tied. That is a way of saying that an English-speaking Cameroonian cannot be president, even if he won in regular, free and fair elections. And after that period, the current president, I think he out of the popularity that he had when he became the second president of Cameroon after Amadou Ahidjo, he then realized that organizing free and fair elections, organizing free and fair elections in Cameroon, he was not that popular to win elections. And then he started now setting up mechanisms that most illiberal democracies will do, finding ways to rig elections, ensuring that civil liberties are seized, and progressively clamping down on English-speaking Cameroonians or Southern Cameroonians. So just to fast forward, back in 2016, you can imagine the number of years right down from 1972 right to 2016. It tells you that there is an abscess that needs to be attended to. So back in 2016, lawyers and teachers of English-speaking extraction. Now, because of the unique nature of the creation of Cameroon, the English-speaking zone practices the common law, which is what happens in Nigeria. And the common law system has its unique way. You have principles like presumption of innocence, those kind of things. In terms of practical day-to-day life, makes Southern Cameroonians feel the pinch of having joined, coming to a union where those fundamental rights are abused. Just to keep it very simple, the problem that came in 2016 was that the common law lawyers were saying that we want a return to decent legal practice where common law lawyers will be charged with law administration following common law standards. Now, what was happening was, because it was a progressive pattern of assimilation and enslavement, the civil law judges were redeployed from French-speaking areas to come and serve in English-speaking zones. That's to tell you that even the legal standards were being obliterated, and the people did not definitely secure access to justice as they should have if the standards of the common law were respected, if their people, first of all, were charged in giving the justice which they were meant to consume. The other aspect was with education, which sometimes is simplified. Sometimes when you get it on media, the impression you get is that the problem is linguistic. Language is just a manifestation of the structural issues, just like the overtake. I mean, just like the courts, the legal standards. The educational sector created a scenario whereby you would have teachers for the sake of employment. You have teachers who barely speak English deployed to English-speaking schools because they need the jobs. And now, because they need the jobs and the Anglophones have been progressively assimilated, which then implies that even access to economic opportunity has been greatly affected even within their own regions, to a point that people who technically have English as a second language are now redeployed in their schools to teach their children So just imagine someone with French-speaking extraction employed in English schools when you have an Anglophone who is well trained in English, who can speak. So you can see that these were concrete issues. Sometimes when I follow on media, you've had, it has been, I would say it has been, the problem has not been often well articulated, even in media institutions like CNN. Many times when you follow up this conflict, you would hear things like, oh, because of linguistic and cultural differences. It's not just that. It has an economic imperative. There is an undertone that actually means that, because Cameroon now claims to have a commitment towards the harmonization. That is the excuse they would use. They would tell you they want to harmonize the common law and civil law to have a Cameroonian legal system. But in essence, what they call a Cameroonian legal system is tilted much more towards civil law practice or French legal practice. And the idea is actually to destroy everything that's English speaking and to use that as a justification to occupy even the jobs. Because how would you explain what is the rationale behind employing people of French-speaking descent in an area when you know that the stronghold for, in terms of even economic activity, before now they'll tell you that Anglophones had invested heavily in education. So there's just no excuse there's really no reason why children of English-speaking extraction should be taught by people that have learned English technically as a second language. Because even though in Cameroon constitutionally they say it's a bilingual country, we all know that French-speaking zone focuses on French, and even the English-speaking zone, when you go to administrative circles, sometimes you would be spoken in French. It's the language of instruction as a way of telling you that we are in control, rather than the constitutional requirement that a bilingual country the expectation should be that you should be able to speak both languages if you work for the civil service. But that's not what obtains. As a Cameroonian in what is Cameroon today, if you're an Anglophone, to be very honest, to navigate your way through that system, you're expected to speak French, or if not, be comprehensive in French enough to exist, rather than a system that accommodates both cultures and both languages. So in 2016, teachers and lawyers came together and organized the union to make concrete demands for those two specific aspects to be changed. Rather than address these concrete demands, the response was very heavy-handed. And you can imagine lawyers being dragged in the streets for asking something which is so legitimate and so concrete. And that did not only happen to lawyers of English-speaking extraction, but as well as teachers. And at the same time, one of the only English-speaking universities, Cameroon, which is the University of Buea, you would see that there was a logic that it was almost systemic. There was a protest going on in the University of Buea, which is the only English-speaking state university, and which came only after a lot of protests, after people lost their lives. That's how that university was created. So for Southern Cameroonians, everything they have had to enjoy, if that's even the right word, in the context of Cameroon, they've had to fight for. They've had to lose lives to have even their rights to education enjoyed, which has been taken back, because that same university now, what's happening is they've continued the process of redeploying people of French-speaking extraction in the context of Cameroon. They would use, they're very smart. When this is explained to a third party who doesn't really understand the crux of the matter, you might simplify it to mean, oh no, these are strategies to ensure that the country is one. But that's mostly happening in the English-speaking zones and not in the French-speaking zones. So when that crackdown came in 2016, it further radicalized people, and people felt more bad about it. And that anger that was highly triggered by the high-handedness of the government finally led to people demanding a return to a two-state federation, and finally, now where we find ourselves now, they're now asking for the restoration of their state that once existed. That is why, in the case of Southern Cameroon, you would hear some groups talk about the restoration of Southern Cameroon because it once existed as a state, and this is what offends the people the most, which is now degenerated into a very deadly armed conflict, which is marked by a high disregard for humanitarian law, human rights, where you have the touching of, you've had military Cameroon military operatives touch more than 350 villages burnt to the ground. You can imagine the scale of atrocities. I would even say most analysts are already going through some kind of fatigue to have to describe the scale of atrocities that have been experienced so far in the Southern Cameroon without a corresponding response that befits that scale of atrocities in Southern Cameroon.
Wow. Thank you for this chronology. It's really tough to take in. A lot is really happening. And I can see from the beginning it's been skewed. The imbalance seems to be, the country seems to be set up to fail by the colonial powers. Otherwise, why was there no option C for the Hamba land people to decide to stay on their own rather than make it a choice between the devil and the deep blue sea, like I interjected earlier on, because that was a reason probably they want to join Nigeria. Maybe they've seen what we are going through in Nigeria. I'm a Nigerian today, and that's why they were a bit skeptical. And there's also perhaps could perceive what will happen with the La Republic in the future. And all seems to have come to be now. Unfortunately, people are paying the price with their own blood, and people are being displaced, people are being maimed and killed. And that brings me to my next question, that why is the world being silent about this? Do you know the reason? The Nigerian actress Stella Damasus was also asking the same question the other time. Why is the world quiet on Ambazonian issue? Chris Fonye, please tell us if you know.
Thank you for that question. That's a very important question, and I think that's a question that has been lingering in the minds of so many people. I mean, sometimes even very, very reputed international civil servants. I think it's just that's the, I don't know if they call the nasty side of international politics, which is really grounded in interest and power. That for me would be the technical reason, because the two countries involved that you would expect a decent effort in terms of constructive engagement would be the United Kingdom and France. And these two countries are members of the Security Council. So to say, should they really want a definite solution in the Southern Cameroon? I mean, these are two major players. This is not a country that was colonized by countries that have lost international prominence. For instance, like Portugal, Belgium, which are not still that powerful. Cameroon was colonized by France and Britain, which are members of the Security Council. So if you ask me, one of the reasons that is not getting attention, I think that it does not really play, the existence of Southern Cameroon as a state does not really play to their interest. There are some currents which say that the Southern Cameroon being British territory was a tacit agreement between English and France sharing the spoils of colonialism at the time that the British felt it was time to retreat because of the burden that came with administering territories overseas. So Southern or British Southern Cameroonians in that context were left on their own. And France just simply used its shrewd methods with a territory that was exclusively French to find a way to assimilate and engulf the British Southern Cameroon. But to respond to your question, I would simply say it's just a matter of interest. It's a matter of there is also, to be honest, I think one of the problems it's it's conflict fatigue, what I'll call fatigue. There are just too many conflicts happening around the world at this particular time that it's even hard, to be very honest, as a human rights activist, for putting on my lens of trying to kind of scope the scale of atrocities across the world. It's very tiring at times, because you're asking yourself, to what extent will intervention be effective in these particular circumstances when you have conflict in DRC, which is unending, Central African Republic is burning, Nigeria itself is not at peace. Yeah. If you just take a bird's eye view on Africa, you would see that, contrary to the Agenda 2063, which talks about silencing the guns, I mean, the guns are even getting louder. And so I think that conflict fatigue could be one of them, because with conflict fatigue, I think, first of all, conflict generally to manage is very expensive. Having to do with displaced people, all these negotiations, then it becomes a little bit more complex to prioritize conflicts, because there is no capacity. And then there's also what I'll call what is the preferred or the popular conflicts, which would usually always be topical, if not of Southern Cameroonians. I think Southern Cameroonians have done a great job in terms of mediatizing the scale of atrocities happening in South via Twitter, different social media channels. If not of that, I think it would have been one of those areas where there's a silent genocide going on. But that said, through the voices of people like Stella Damascus, Jan Egeland, and so many others who are beginning to get concerned about what's happening in Southern Cameroon, I think it's getting much more prominence than it was about 3, 4, or 5 years ago when the conflict actually started. So it's really hard. It's hard to give a scientific response to why this conflict is not gaining attention, because in terms of horrendous acts, everything, I mean, I wonder what atrocity has not been committed in Cameroon. Villages have been torched, babies have been killed. I mean, this is not collateral damage. Targeted and shot by military operatives. There is just nothing that you can think of in terms of mass atrocities that has not happened in the Southern Cameroon. So it's hard. I think I wouldn't be even doing a disservice to the people to give a specific reason why this is not being on the, because it's mysterious. It's just like the feeling that the Rohingyas had at the onset of their genocide, which has gone so bad that even now, it's now that the world is even talking about exclusive recognition of the atrocities that have happened. It's the same with the Southern Cameroonians. It's just like when you are victims, the powerlessness that comes with being a victim in a world which is defined by power, but pretends to operate based on deployment. I think it goes back to the debate in international relations, which says international relations are organized by interest and power rather than by law. Because if it was law, you were expecting that all the efforts that the international community has mobilized towards international law, towards mechanisms to ensure that atrocities like that should never happen, like since the Rwandan genocide. I mean, the common phrase was never again. But sadly enough, since the Rwandan genocide, seems like we are actually facing a resurgence of mass atrocities, and we are moving into a decade of impunity, where almost every part of the world has populations, vulnerable populations, at the mercy of their governments, where there is progressively shrinking civic space and an assault to the right to peaceful protest, whether it be in Nigeria, like the EndSARS movement, and all over the world. I would call it conflict fatigue. I would call it an immoral international system that, at the end of the day, exists based on interest and power rather than law and humanitarian concerns. So apart from those, I am certainly sure that the list is inexhaustive. There might be other reasons, but most of those reasons tend to be strategic. You know, the Cameroonian government, for instance, I'll give you a host of these strategic reasons. The Cameroonian government, for instance, supports America in the fight against Boko Haram, which is something both our countries experience. The same government that has a reputation for committing atrocities supplies peacekeeping troops in Central Africa. That is how complex the relationship is. It is a complex relationship of give and take, so much so that it becomes difficult for the big boys to hold accountable the same leaders they are doing business with. So I think we need much more of a sense, a more ethical international world all the way, irrespective of the gains that come with bilateral interactions. States should be held accountable for atrocities, irrespective of the support they provide to some of these. So there's the geopolitical aspect of it. There's also the aspect of resources. You would definitely know that most of these inept or most of these corrupt regimes tend to do business with some of these Western countries. They might sound very, very loud in the front door, speaking the gospel of respect for the rule of law, human rights, but in the backyard, they still do business. Like I'm not expert on Nigeria, but Nigeria has experienced a significant level of challenges in terms of human security under Buhari. You're asking yourself, what is the reason that we don't feel sufficient pressure to at least change some of the things that will limit the loss of lives in Nigeria, for instance? But because at the end of the day, Nigeria is a strategic partner. Whether you like it or not, at that level, these states do not make decisions based on the loss of lives. That is the sad reality about how international relations play. That is the role that we as activists, humanitarian actors, we have to continue to advocate for human security to have primacy over very, very narrow economic interests that often cause them to overlook issues like human rights abuses, the rule of law, and all these ingredients that facilitate the commission of mass atrocities across the world.
That's right. As they say in international relations, who is the international policeman? There's really no international policeman. So we can only just hope that the camera of the world zooms on Cameroon and the southern Cameroonian people, and their struggle is highlighted, and hopefully something happens. But we're still going to ask more questions in that regard. But a little deviation. I was watching was CNN or one of these French channel yesterday, and they were showing your country, Cameroon. But this issue seems to cut across the divide, rather how they divide it now, Francophone, Anglophone, this perpetual illegal detention of activists. This is not even an Ambazonia issue. I'm sure you've been the protection officer, so you should be aware of all these other issues, that cut across. So what do you think is the problem? The reason for this, where they just lock someone up indefinitely, no justice, no trial. And the mom was crying. I felt her pain. And this was just one out of many from what they were saying. Is this an issue you are conversant with, Mr. Fonye?
I think it's a problem. It's a problem of governance. I think Africa needs to take itself serious. I have spoken on this subject a couple of times. I even get the feeling that I'm tired of saying it. It's like it's a tired refrain. Africa needs to take governance and respect of its own people very, very serious.
So this is not just about Cameroon, this particular issue.
Yes, that's why I'm saying that Africa as a whole, you would realize that the rule of law, especially respect for human rights, in Africa tends to appear, respect for citizens appear to be a luxury. That is why African countries that do not have a track record of repression tend to really, really, really stand out. And it's difficult to even flag up the number of African countries that do not believe in this issue of repression. I've even heard some commentators pride themselves in the fact that it's an African way. It's not an African way. Liberty, it's a human, it's a universal, desire to feel free, to enjoy liberties. Is something which is human. It's not African, nor is it Western. Sometimes I've even heard people even go to the point of saying, "Oh no, democracy is Western." Democracy is only Western because we choose to see the world from other people's lenses. If we could take these from a perspective of near humanity, you would realize that organizing maybe free and fair elections, ensuring that people are treated decently. You don't need instruction from an outsider on how to treat people decently to define your standards of decency. It is the same thing. So I think issues that have to deal with like arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearances, torture, these are things that African leadership or African leaders themselves have to look within themselves and ask and continue to. It's definitely a work in progress because universally it's a challenge. The whole issue of repression, shrinking civic space, these are things that are beginning to change, not just in Africa, but across the world. So for me, it's a collective call for humanity. But in Africa, I think it's even worse. Level of repression, people being arrested for just simply having an opinion that is different from the oppressed or from the governor's or opinion can land you in prison. A lot of people in Cameroon are political prisoners, and also maybe in Nigeria and other parts of Africa. So I think it's much more an issue of political will. There's no rocket science about values. If a country decides that it's going to respect its people, you're going to feel that in the outcomes that will come. It will lead to more people feeling committed to work for that country. It will lead to a situation where more people want to reinvest back in their country because what has been given to them, they want to give back. But in essence, if these people feel like they are being lashed out, they are being treated very, very poorly, they will either fight back because they don't have any other opportunity because their backs are against the wall, or they will find opportunities to migrate, as we would see, which is another problem now, migration crisis, where huge numbers of people are leaving the shores of Africa. I have heard that debate almost often simplified. People say, no, you're moving abroad. Who's going to develop Africa? But it's a human tendency first. The reason you're moving abroad is not because you hate your country. It's because you're a human being that seeks the best. Maybe for your family first. They say the society, the unit of society is defined by family first. Many people moved abroad because they wanted to get a better life to support maybe their families, themselves, and build a better life, even for their continent. Just to tell you, just in line with the question you asked, a country like Cameroon prevents the whole issue of dual nationality. When you think about it, the idea behind that policy is not developmental, but political. Because according to them, they have observed that much of the power that oppressed people enjoy back at home by way of economic independence comes from the diaspora. So that policy seeks to limit the power that can come from people in the diaspora to participate in the development of their own country, even as foreign nationals. Australia, which is a developed country, for instance, accepts dual nationality. In that case, say, for instance, as if were I an Australian and a Cameroonian at the same time, I could contribute my talents as a Cameroonian to build the Cameroonian community in Australia. And that rather adds more value to Australia than takes it away. But go back to Cameroon. Were I an Australian, I will be prevented from really contributing in terms of economic or developmental process in a concrete sense, because First of all, there is a policy that kind of alienates me because I have another nationality, and which sometimes is even applied in a skewed manner. You must have heard recently Samuel Eto'o's the footballer icon was just voted in as president of the Federation. Nobody's even talking about that. Samuel Eto'o has dual nationality. So what happened to that law that prevents other Cameroonians from providing their talents, their skills in the service of their nation? Why is the law applied selectively? You would see that without so much exaggeration, you would see that it's not distant from the problem of being francophone, of being aligned with the regime in power. Because I can assure you, where Samuel Eto'o is an advocate of, for instance, the respect for the human rights of people of the Southern Cameroon, they wouldn't have given him the opportunity to run under a clear legal provision that says you cannot have two nationalities in Cameroon and hold public office. But that is a man. Everyone has gone silent. It tells you a lot. It tells you a lot. In Australia, if there was such a law, an election like that would have been a scandal. I like him. I like Samuel Eto'o as a footballer, as a person. In the normal functioning of things, that would have been my wish. But the law is the law. The law is not the law. So, the law should not be selectively applied.
Sorry to interrupt you, Chris Fonye. So, are you telling me in terms of public policies and the constitutional implementation in Cameroon, there is a dichotomy between the South and the North? Is that correct?
There is. We see that all the time. There's selective application of the law. That is why more than ever, Southern Cameroonians are making it very, very clear that being Southern Cameroonian elicits a different treatment. Like, I'll give you a very good example of what has been happening in French Cameroon. Disagreements, or let's say altercations between civilians and forces of law and order, lead to situations where you even have civilians fighting and sometimes even beating forces of law and order in a normal civil altercation where probably the civilian did not, maybe failed to comply with the rule or with an order provided by the police. In Southern Cameroon, it's the opposite. They shoot to kill. That is a clear distinction of law enforcement. Just in about 2 months, we've had 3 glaring cases where babies were the target of law enforcement. Where a situation where a policeman stopped, or gendarme stopped a vehicle. Most of the time, what creates the delay is that the policeman doesn't even usually stop the vehicle for control, but they're usually more interested in the bribe, in the 500 which they get from the drivers. But in that particular case, as the stories have been disclosed on media, in that particular case, there was a woman taking her kid to school. She was in this car that is claimed had some issues. I was not compliant with the orders of the gendarme, and in order to ensure enforcement, as the story goes, the gendarme shot a baby in the law enforcement. And that, to tell you that it's not a coincidence. A similar incident happened just about 2 weeks after, and even a month after. These guys went to a secondary school and shot down school children. Now, what is not even said in the media, there are situations in which the hired militias hired by the state of Cameroon are deployed to create mayhem in Southern Cameroon, and they use that to blackmail the revolution, which has become armed, to give the impression that no, this is done by the separatists, the forces fighting for separation. What is the sense of going to kill people that you consider part of your identity? There's really something illogical in that. So those are just extreme points of the analysis of the dichotomy between the enforcement of the rule of law. I've given you a very good example, and this is very fresh, which is something that may even still generate international interest if somebody has the courage to be vocal about it. Samuel Eto'o is creating a lot of there's a lot of euphoria because he's a young person. For once in Cameroon, you've had elections where a sense of competence has overridden age, power, and seat-tight leaders who use often unorthodox methods to govern institutions. They're not even competent to govern. But that said, the issue here related to the discussion which we are having is, did that happen within the legal books of the country? Is Samuel Eto'o Cameroonian and Spanish at the same time? If he has dual nationality, he cannot run for public office according to the laws of Cameroon. But there he is, and I already see the BBC is already reporting on that. Everyone is going to report on that, but no one is going to pick. That's an aberration to the rule of law, and that tells you the seriousness with which we deal with issues of law, because where Samuel Eto'o is someone that was considered to be some kind of threat to the political regime, that would have been treated much more. You would have then felt how people invoking the law of the land. People would have been saying things like, no, but he has to respect the laws of the land. He's not Cameroonian. But in this case, that has been ignored. And that happens in almost every other aspect of law enforcement.
Wow. These are tough situations, I must confess, but it's a reality we are facing in this situation. So, is it okay to say you are in exile at the moment? And if yes, do you plan to return to Cameroon someday? And in two-in-one question, do you also see this conflict coming to an end? If so, how do you see everything unraveling? The end point of this Ambazonia struggle? What do you think will be the outcome? You going home? Do you understand the question together now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Get the question. That's a very good question. Just like so many people, I would give you an example of what's happening to so many, to explain to you the risk that so many Southern Cameroonians who have been vocal about what's going on. There are so many situations in which people land in the airports and they are picked, they are sniffed, and they are taken to prison. There's so many cases. In fact, in the case of the Naira 10 case, the guys were picked up in Nigeria itself, in the Naira hotel in Abuja, and were whisked off into Cameroon in total disregard of international law, where you cannot refuel political asylums. I think that was even challenged in the Nigerian Federal Court, and there's even a ruling which was followed by I think Felana, the popular human rights lawyer, and just to give some context and even to follow up on the idea of the rule of law. I mean, these are countries that are all signatories or respect customary international law, which says you cannot refuel. But you can see that Nigeria, together with Cameroon, they connive to carry out an illegal act, and that has helped to escalate a conflict that is leading to so many deaths. That said, I certainly do not feel safe. I would be extremely naive to feel that should I return to Cameroon at this moment, I will be treated with kid gloves. No, and it's not. People simplify it. It's generally a very, very tough decision to be out of your country of birth for political reasons and issues related to security. That said, just like everyone, problems in the family wouldn't make you hate your family. I think the logical way that a moderate or decent mind will think is that issues get resolved. It is sad to say, but the present stage of that conflict shows rather more seeds of further escalation, because rather than revert to the call for dialogue or for a mediated settlement, because at this point, I think the most effective remedy will be a mediated settlement where whosoever acts as a mediator is going to treat the parties to the conflicts as exclusive parties that have underlying interests that must be addressed. That's the only way that conflict can be resolved. Like every other conflict, no matter how deadly, no matter how long it may take, the sad thing is, maybe the fortunate thing is that all conflicts will end on the negotiating table. So it's more of human greed, ego that makes us let conflicts of that nature fester for too long. So much so that the most fundamental issues that were initially demanded have now gone to a point that it becomes almost irreconcilable. What are you going to do with people, thousands of people who do not even have, whose homes have been burnt? Even if you bring them back, how do you process all of that? The scale of the trauma itself, let alone the possibility to start back life in a country where even when there was no war, the governance situation already impoverished people at levels that is even difficult to explain. So you're asking yourself a simple question. A country that finds it hard to deliver social welfare to its people, even in times of peace, what then becomes of that country even after having taken the option of the war that it could avoid? So you can only, in realistic terms, you can only see gloom and doom in front. But like I said, like every human being, we can only be hopeful that senses will revert back to the state, which for me has the largest responsibility in terms of finding out a workable solution with the other party, which is the Southern Cameroons, to ensure that there is sustainable peace, or there's the possibility of coexistence between these two states or between these two nations. So to answer to your question, I would say it is my hope that not just for myself, because this is not just about me, but this is about thousands, millions of people. There is nothing you benefit. There is no benefit for people killing themselves. It doesn't matter if it's even an interstate war or an intrastate war. I would be very, very unhappy today if Cameroon was locked down in a war with Nigeria. That's not good for Africa. It's not good for humanity. So I would say that my hope is that Cameroon and Africa at large would finally succumb to some of the cliches or some of the slogans which they themselves have created, like silencing the guns, which tend to be more rhetoric than practical action. So Tunde, to respond to your question, I would say I'm still hopeful, and that is why, even though I find myself in Australia, I have tirelessly decided to constructively engage all areas where I think help can come from. And it's not just seeking for a political solution, but also finding ways in which people can have humanitarian service delivery, given the dire circumstances they find themselves in. You have basically people, Cameroonian refugees in Nigeria, begging because basically the humanitarian system is under strain. There's just so much going on everywhere. UNHCR is not even sufficiently armed enough to provide the kind of support, the fundamental support they need to recover as refugees. So it's not a situation that anyone would like to fester beyond its capacity. People living a lifetime in the bush doesn't make sense. Women are living in the bush, and I'm not talking about and about tens. I'm talking about thousands. Hundreds of people are living in the bush. That's their reality. Giving birth in the bush, that's not normal life. So it is my wish that with the support of the international community and to emphasize, especially Africa, I expect regional organizations like, but I think even though recently there's been a certain level of criticism about the ECOWAS, but I think regional organizations need to play a more active role in resolving African conflicts. Many a time when I talk about the international community, people think about America, the UK, but what is wrong? What is wrong about Africans asserting themselves and providing solutions for their problems? Because at the end of the day, it's a context which they understand best. That said, I think with the collective endeavor of everyone that has a stake for peace, we need to keep amplifying the calls for a mediated settlement that will call both parties to a dialogue and to find an acceptable solution that address the underlying interest of the parties so that civilians can live in peace. That's all people need. People need peace, but they also need justice.
Thank you for your response and deep insights and philosophical engagement on this all important questions among several questions. I've got two more questions. Our time is fast spent, and I know you've got stuff to do yourself. So, do you subscribe to the school of thought that say five-time African champion Cameroon does not deserve to host the AFCON in January, especially with all the problem going on? Some people believe AFCON should be the list of priority for Cameroon, and CAF and FIFA should strip them of the hosting right. Do you subscribe to that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not because I have bad faith in Cameroon hosting a Nations Cup. I think, first of all, it was already overdue. It was overdue. The last time Cameroon hosted a Nations Cup was in the 70s. You would want to find out why. But part of the reason is the same governance I'm talking about. Because Cameroon has had the bad habit of going abroad and winning Nations Cups and Continental Cup, being continental champions abroad, and not even being able to host one ever since 1970. That has been the challenge thrown to Cameroon. But over that long stretch of time, Cameroon was able to host. And I'm bringing up this point because it's related to governance. It's not because they didn't want to, but simply because they were not effectively structured to host a tournament of that caliber. That said, what is the sense of Cameroon putting more energy on hosting an international competition of that magnitude in the scale of, in the presence of mass atrocities? I think it's high time that that the international community puts a lot of emphasis of using football as a real rallying opportunity for peace. And that brings me back to the initial discussion which we had about sanctions. That's a kind of sanction that could be brought to bear on Cameroon. Cameroonians are very passionate about soccer. Preventing them from hosting or using that as a precondition, using the resolution of that war, of that conflict, could be a very, 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 it could act as leverage to make Cameroon behave. So I am totally against Cameroon hosting. I think it's an insult to humanity. It's an insult to the people. It's not different from, even though in this term the context is unique. It's not different from the treatment which blacks receive in apartheid South Africa, where you get the feeling that people, animals even have a priority over people. It's just to give a comparison or a metaphor that's a little bit out of place. But that's the best way I can put it. It's an insult to people that live daily under the sound of guns, IEDs, their houses being burned, and you're organizing this tournament where there's a lot of fanfare, and that fanfare is supposed to benefit the states that is disconnected from its people. It's a paradox. And in one of the cities that is going to host that tournament is Limbe, which is found in southern Cameroon. So I think I am absolutely against the fact that Cameroon should be hosting a continental competition of that magnitude without addressing the issue of mass atrocities. We are not talking about a mere, it's not just an isolated, it's not a low, so many people try to treat it as if it's a low intensity crisis. That crisis is not low intensity. You have conservative statistics say more than 800,000 people have been displaced. That's a conservative statistics because it should be moving now to millions. People have been displaced. As we speak, just a few days ago, the military has continued its burning spree, where it keeps burning the houses of people in total disregard of humanitarian law, which requires that parties to a conflict distinguish between military and non-military targets. What is it? What is the point of getting into of burning a house with individuals inside who are not engaged in combat? Even in a regular war, the laws of war require that if someone has put down their weapons, you cannot kill them. So it tells you the intensity, the barbaric nature of this military and their activities in the assumption of what they call trying to preserve national integrity and the sovereignty of what they call one an indivisible Cameroon. So I would say without any hesitation that if there are any voices that have the power to make that happen, to listen, that a nation's cup is not more important than the lives of individuals, not even an individual, let alone thousands and millions of people living at the mercy of nature. Because as it stands now, I would rightfully say that the citizens of Southern Cameroon are orphans because they have cried. They don't even have a voice to cry anymore. I was very, 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 very happy and grateful to see people like Stella Damasus put her name. And I would also say, Tunji, I am very, very grateful for your initiative. This is what Africa should look like. I mean, I have to say this, not because we are live. We know ourselves on Facebook. We have never met. We connected on Facebook and we brought up this idea. And I felt this is something good, no matter how hard it is for me to get up early at 6. But I felt that I need to respond to a brother that means nothing than peace. The African
Sorry to interrupt you. Lastly, because you're also a peace lecturer, so I know you've talked already. You've analyzed all the problem in terms of the wars going on in Africa, why we don't have peace. But do you strongly believe someday? This is the last question, that there is hope for achieving peace on our continent. Do you think so, Comrade Fine?
Yeah, I think the reason I believe so is that when you look at the history of Africa, Africans are the race that have undergone the most extreme form of oppression, dehumanization, without a corresponding commitment to retaliate. When I go by that analysis, it makes me feel that Africans have in them what it takes to forget the past and rebuild the future. Because the reality of these is that after all is said and done, is that the damage that has been done has been done. It is incumbent on present and future generations to consciously commit to reunite, to see a strength in one another rather than an opponent nature. You would use the life of Mandela, who is a global icon, not just an African icon. When you look at his life, you see a man that has spent productive years of his life in prison, to come out of prison and forgive his perpetrators, all in the interest of something bigger than himself. The natural human being, I think, apart from Jesus Christ, you don't have so many individuals in the world that would go through that kind of pain, come out of prison, forgive. And that is why I'm tapping from the African compassion, sense of compassion. I just believe that if we progressively invest in one another, kill that greed that makes our leaders want to own everything, own their people, own things which they don't need. All people need is social welfare, if I could be able to summarize. I'm sure Africans would not care about who is the leader. If they got up to go to work, drove on a road that is not broken, do not have to go miles to carry drinking water, do not have to fend so much to have a job. These are the things that people really need. And these are the things that will bring the unity that we all seek and pray for, which is going to be the basis upon which the guns will be silenced. That is really my hope. I know it's not easy to achieve, but with positive narratives, continuous capacity buildings, awareness raising, I think we can at least cover a reasonable distance in that journey to peace.
Thank you, Comrade Chris Fonye, for coming on the Tunji Ofe show. I wish you well.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
It was my honor. Thank you.